are in my life.
You never told me that.
I'm not supposed to. uh, really, with a year older than me, kind of making the path for me and making sure she pushed all the snow back in behind her as she went. So I got to break my own path. But Lois was one of the darlings of the school. That she came home loaded with books this high and her clarinet case on top and trudging through the snow to get home and I'd come waltzing in and say I did all my work at school. And every 9 weeks or so there seemed to be some calling out of the actual result of which worked better. And I think we also learned a lot from each other. I learned that dedication and hard work is important and meaningful, and I think she learned from me that having a good time is important as well too. So that's nice. We grew up in Skokie on the North Shore. Our parents made sure there was always a canoe available, and we went canoeing out in the Skokie lagoons at times. And there's epic stories of my dad, who considered himself a top-notch canoeist, taking me out in the middle of Isle Royale, of Lake Superior, off the coast of Isle Royale, in about what I imagine were about 4 foot high waves, but got no facts to prove it. But and that was to visit Lois, who was working at Isle Royale at that time too. So she'll talk a bit about her history of how she got so involved, and it'll be interesting to me to hear her perspective as well too. But something about the life of being a conservationist and being really involved with the nuts and bolts of how do you make the world a better place has a big purpose, I think, for all of us. So, other than that, beyond that, I welcome you and jump off the stage.
That's my, thanks, Mike. Can you hear me on this thing all right? Okay. Um, well, let's see. What am I going to talk about? I guess Mike wanted me to talk a little bit about my history with the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and land trusts, and my career in habitat protection, habitat restoration, public education in the conservation arena. And so I'm so I'm don't want to talk too much about me. That's really not important. What I want to talk more about is some of the philosophies and ideas that I came to understand and appreciate through my career in conservation. Um, so I will start out, after saying that, I will start out with a little bit about me because this is kind of a fun beginning of the story, but it's a bigger story than just me. I think, how is it that a kid growing up in Skokie, Illinois, gets interested in conservation as a career? There you are living in a lot of neon and concrete and steel jungle. And somehow or another, I got enticed with the world of conservation. And I would say my three big childhood influences started out with this. Oh, that's the wrong slide. I'm sorry. With, oh, there's my pointer. With this. That's an entrance to a forest preserve in Chicago. And one of my first early childhood remembrances, truly, was my mom taking me to the forest preserves near where we lived in Skokie. And she would kindly, I emphasize kindly, drill me on the trees and which trees were which as we were walking the trails. And, all these years later, I remember that vividly. And that was a big influence. I think kids need, if they're going to care about the natural world, they need some kind of influence, they need some sort of connection. I think that's why there's so much education, emphasis in schools to try to get kids excited about the natural world. If it starts when you're a kid, it tends to stay for a lifetime, I think. So it started out with my mom in the forest preserves of Chicago. And it reminds me that having a small natural area close to home is just as vitally important for the protection of the environment, for the protection of the earth, as having big, grand, glorious national parks. We need it all. I think it was Frederick Law Olmsted who was quoted once as saying, every kid needs some woods within, a half a mile of their home, something like that. That's a bastardization of the real quote. And then after the Chicago Forest Preserves, came these kinds of adventures. My mom and dad blessed Mike and I and my other two brothers with summer vacations, oftentimes 2-week vacations, and not always, but many, many, many times we went to the national parks. And this was, ironically enough, in Acadia National Park. Notice this little stern-faced boy. He's very cute, with a blueberry bucket, in charge of collecting blueberries that day at Acadia National Park as we hiked along the Jordan Pond Trail. So there's Mike. There's my mom. There's one of my older brothers. And there's me. And notice who's in the front of the line. Leading the way. But Acadia National Park is where I ended up spending all of the 1980s. And that's still close to home for me. So thank you. Acadia National Park is on the coast of Maine, midway up the coast of Maine. Sorry? Near Bar Harbor, yes, yes. And so we took national park visits to many, many places out west, all over the place. And that, I think, became a real pivotal experience for me. And then finally came Mount Rainier when there's little me, 16 years old, 1970. So you can do the math. My mom Mom is a key influence here in all of this, but my mom saw an advertisement in Better Homes and Gardens magazine, and it was just a little ad, and it said, and for all Better Homes and Gardens magazine, for Pete's sakes, it said, for boys interested in a worthwhile summer experience in our national parks, write to the Student Conservation Association. So my mom cut that out, put it on my little desk in my little bedroom, and I looked at it and I said, Mom, I can't apply for that. It says it's for boys. It was one of the few times I remember my mom looking at me with some disdain and disgust. And she said, for Pete's sakes, haven't I taught you better than that by now, kid? You need to send them a letter and find out what's going on. So I did. And back in 1970, I learned that the Student Conservation Association had 2 programs for high school girls and about 15, 20 programs for high school boys. So I filled out the application. It seemed like a really big thing until later on I learned what a federal government application looked like. But it was a big deal. I filled out this application, and by golly, I got accepted to go to Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. And I worked there for 3 weeks as a volunteer. And it was 3 weeks of every first in the world I could imagine. It was the first time away from home. It was the first time on an airplane. It was the first time camping out with a bunch of other girls my age who cared about conservation. It was the first time doing a conservation work project in a national park. We were trying to rehabilitate an alpine meadow around a lake that had been overcamped and the alpine meadow had been trampled. It was the first time backpacking. That's amazing. And just as a little side note, our camp counselors were Mr. and Mrs. I, wonderful couple. And Mr. and Mrs. I, their real last name was Inslee. That may ring a bell for some of you who pay attention to politics. There was a little boy running around the camp with us that was Mr. and Mrs. I's son. And we didn't pay any attention to him. He was just this little boy. Yes, you got it. His name is Jay Inslee, who's the governor of Washington State, whose climate change legislation I just heard on NPR the other day is up for possible rescinding in Washington State, but he put together some great climate change legislation. Hopefully it will stick. But he ran for president back when Biden ran a few years ago, and he ran on a platform of climate change is the most important thing we have to focus on. And he supported that by saying, I'm not just a climate change president, because this relates to everything. If we don't deal with our, so anyways, I knew when I heard Jay Inslee speaking, this was a message that he got loud and clear, strongly from the heart, from his amazing parents. And so anyways, that was kind of a cool thing. And I sadly missed ever having the opportunity to thank his parents, I think just by a couple of years, because when Jay was running for president, he came to Maine and I got a invitation to go to some household where he was talking. And unfortunately, I was going to be out of town at the time, but that's when I confirmed. I always suspected that he was their kid, and I confirmed it through the woman who had the house party for him. And I wanted to pass on a message through him to get in touch with his parents and tell them how pivotal they were in my life. And unfortunately, his parents had both died a few years earlier, so I never had a chance to say goodbye to them. But Skokie, from Skokie, Illinois, and the forest preserves to the national, to visits to the national parks when I was kids, and then to my first experience actually working as a volunteer when I was 16 years old. That truly set me off on a path. So I'm a proud alumni of the Student Conservation Association, which has now grown into a much, 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 much larger organization that does work in public lands and even some nonprofit private lands for conservation for kids, high school kids and college kids all over the country. It's a noble organization, and that organization, along with my mom, truly changed my life. And so that started me on a journey in the days when it wasn't so common for girls to want to be national park rangers, and we didn't have too many role models in that direction, but I was young and dumb and just knew that's what I was going to do. So I started my path towards working in the National Park Service, and this is a little montage of the parks that I spent time in various capacities. Kind of going clockwise from the upper left, this is where Mike almost died in that canoe with my dad. That's Isle Royale National Park on a more placid day. The next one, there I worked as the baker at the lodge. But the chief ranger at the time, I don't think this would happen today. The chief ranger knew I was an earnest little girl, and he gave me a chance to do a ranger talk for the park visitors that were staying in the campground, which actually became pivotal a few years later, which I'll explain. And so from Isle Royale that summer, which was a glorious place to be, I went the next summer, my first actual official National Park Service job at the bottom of the barrel, a GS2, if you know how that works. I was a GS2 backcountry aide at North Cascades National Park. There was I'm saying too much now, but that was there was a funny story with North Cascades too, because back then you were allowed to apply to every single national park in the country. And being who my brother described me of being, I was committed to working in the national parks. So I sent one of those big, giant, thick applications of the day out to every single national park in the country, hoping that one would hire me. I don't know how this happened, but I was filling out all those applications, and at that time, North Cascades was a new national park, born like so many national parks of great controversy in the local community. But it was billed as this amazing wilderness park. And I was putting all those applications in the envelopes. I got to the one for North Cascades. It's the only one I said to myself, oh, for Pete's sakes, why are you wasting the postage on this? You'll never get a job at North Cascades. I almost didn't put it in the envelope. I almost didn't send it. And then I said to myself, this is not your plan. If you start saying that, you're going to have a reason to not send out a lot of other applications. Just don't even think about it. Put it in the envelope, send it. Well, guess what? I got 2 applications for summer jobs out of all of those 100 applications I sent out. One was for I think it was called Ashtabula Lake in Oklahoma. It was a national park that never really should have been a national park. I shouldn't say that because I've never been there, but it's just an impoundment, and it was a political thing. The senator or the congressman had the power and made this dumb little impoundment into a national park. They offered me a job And you know who else offered me a national park, a job? North Cascades. That was it. All those applications. The one I almost didn't apply to. So I got a job at North Cascades. I had the best boss in the world there. I thought, wow, if everybody in the National Park Service is like Dan Taylor, this is where I have to be. I found out later that they weren't all quite as great as Dan, but he was a great boss, and he gave me trail days, and I explored all over North Cascades National Park. Just added to my commitment to just be in the North Cascades. And that summer, I lived in this little hippie cabin with a bunch of other park rangers. We all crammed into this tiny little space because we didn't have any money. And one of the rangers there kind of gave me a book to read. He said, read this Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey that I'd never heard of. And some of you are probably familiar with Edward Abbey and his writings. He's an amazing conservation writer. And Desert Solitaire is one of his classics. And there I was in the majesty of the North Cascades, and I read Desert Solitaire, and I said, wow, I got to go to the Southwest. So the next summer, luckily, I got a job at Zion National Park. And that was the year I graduated from college. So Mike remembers this. We got in, I bought a little AMC Gremlin that had been literally totaled in an accident before I got it. It was patched back together by this guy. Some mechanic said it was good mechanically, so I bought the thing for $400. And I put all my gear. This is my first job after college graduation, and I was so excited. And I put everything I needed in that car, plus two extra spare tires, plus my bicycle, plus my brother Mike, plus my best friend from college, Donna, and all their camping gear. And we all crammed into this little AMC Gremlin. And off we went. And we were sitting in the front yard of our home in Skokie, Illinois. And I was getting a little pit in my stomach because, you know, this was the first time I was going to leave home, and I knew it was really leaving. It wasn't going to be my home anymore. And of course, my folks were both there. And at the time, my dad wrote me a handmade card. He always treasured handmade cards, and he wrote one to me. And he handed me the card, and he said to me something that I'll never forget. He said, there would only be one thing sadder today than to see you go, and that would be to see you stay. Whew. And in that sentence, I recognized the love and martyrdom of parenthood. So I went off and had great adventures in Zion National Park. And from Zion, I ended up lucking out and getting a winter seasonal job. I thought I'd be a ski bum that winter if nothing else worked out, but I got a winter seasonal job in Death Valley National Monument. Went back to Zion the next summer because I loved it. The next winter, I had an opportunity to go to the Everglades and work there. And then after the Everglades, what happened? You remembered what I said, chronological or calendar order. Yeah. So from, I don't remember exactly. So anyways, I ended up getting my first permanent job. I went back to Zion for my third season. There's a little longer story there that's not important, and had a permanent job waiting for me in North Dakota that is not here because it wasn't a national park. I took that to get permanent status, and then I moved to Chaco Canyon after a few months in North Dakota. Chaco Canyon is in northwestern New Mexico near the Four Corners. It's an area of amazing Anasazi Indian ruins. Actually, they call them Pueblo Indians. Now, what do they call it? They don't call them Anasazi anymore. But it was the ancient Pueblo Indians. Had a massive cultural center in Chaco Canyon. I worked there for a while. It was an astounding park. It was extremely isolated. My mother was very worried that I was there because there was nobody for a 25-year-old kid to hang out with there. But then I had the opportunity to move to Acadia on the coast of Maine. And I worked at Acadia as the assistant chief of interpretation for a while. For 10 years. I really settled in at Acadia. And didn't really ever think I'd get rousted out of there, but I had an opportunity to go back to graduate school doing studies in Acadia on coyotes and red fox in the park. And I decided, even though my boss asked me if she wanted me to keep my job open for me. I said I'm too young to retire in Acadia, which was a pivotal point. I've thought about that sometimes. Um, and so I moved on after I finished graduate school, and I moved to Mammoth Cave National Park and worked there for about a year and a half. The park again was astounding. I realized I wasn't universally transferable, however, when I went to the rural South, and only stayed there for a year. Ended up wanting to get back to Maine because I had a relationship that was brewing back in Maine. So I figured it was going to be easier to get a job back in Maine if I was in Massachusetts rather than in Kentucky. So I moved to be the chief of interpretation at Minuteman National Historical Park in Concord, Massachusetts, which was interesting. It was a historical park, and I'm really interested. I've grown to be as interested in people history as natural history. Um, I worked there for about a year and a half, and then I ended up switching with a job that I got um, back in Maine with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But before we move on to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I wanted to focus a little bit on some of the lasting messages I cultivated by working in the national parks. Um, and these are sort of random thoughts, but first of all, I wanted to find out how many of you have visited national parks. Great, great. Any favorites? Where? White Mountain? Oh, that's a national forest. White Mountain National Forest. That's not far from where I'm sorry. Oh, cool, cool. Yeah, that's a White Mountains is a national forest, which is different than the national parks. It's a beautiful area too, but the national parks are run with more of a philosophy of preservation, and the national forests run with more of a philosophy of multiple use conservation. So in a national forest, there can be logging. There are more often, let's say, a ski area in a national forest. They're more interspersed with communities and things like that. National parks developed with national parks are in the Department of the Interior. National forests are part of the Department of Agriculture because officially they're there to harvest a crop. There may be wilderness areas in a national forest, so there's kind of some mixing and matching there, but it's a different management regime in a national forest. But it also has recreational areas and astounding hiking and beautiful mountains and things like that at White Mountains National Forest. It's a beautiful place. Any other? Yeah. Oh, Bryce. Yeah. 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 It's Bryce Canyon is a little bit more of a, what would you say, um, a manageable, you can, yeah, the Grand Canyon can seem so vast that you can almost, yeah. The way to make the Grand Canyon manageable and understandable is to hike to the bottom of it like Mike and I did. Then you start seeing it in a more human scale. But yeah, when you're up at the summit or the top of the plateau, it's almost like it's too vast to understand. Yeah.
Valles Caldera.
I'm sorry?
Valles Caldera.
Called the Caldera.
Valles.
Valles Caldera.
Apparently, it's the newest national
Good for you. Wow. See, I'm showing my age. I don't know. Where is it?
park. New
Valles?
Mexico.
Oh, Valles Caldera. Where
Yeah,
in
it's
New
outside
Mexico?
of Albuquerque, and
Oh,
yeah, it's a a dormant volcanic caldera, like up
yeah.
on top of a mountain
Yeah, neat.
near Los Alamos. Yeah.
Cool. I generally know my U.S. geography by national parks, but I'll have to add that to my. Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Our favorite was Arches,
Arches.
and it was part of it was the northernmost part of a swing that started at Grand Canyon and went through Bryce and Zion and all those up to Arches and Canyonlands, and then we turned right and came back through Colorado.
Yeah.
But at the Arches, I remember one of the graphic displays brought to visibility, the concept of the grand staircase.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah,
Let's not talk about that because that's a whole fascinating
oh,
geologic
okay,
story. And I'm
okay.
starting to look at the clock and realize I better keep. What time are we over, Mike?
11:15,
Okay, yeah,
30
I
minutes.
better. I'd love to hear. We can talk more about our stories of national parks later, but let me keep going here, okay? Because otherwise, I won't get to say anything I really wanted to say because all I've been talking about is me so far. But when if you know anything about the national parks, you know that there are 5 different branches or divisions of operating those parks behind the scenes. And I worked in the education interpretation arena of the national parks for most of my career. To be honest, I sort of stumbled into that, but that's mostly what girls were allowed to do back in the day, right? It was the more acceptable, it was the teaching side of the parks. And so as we became the pioneers to be working in the national parks as women, that was the first door that was opened. But it also ended up being the door that that resonated the most for me. There's an old adage in National Park Service lingo, through understanding appreciation, through appreciation, long-term protection. And that's what I always saw our role to be. You know, we think of the national parks as sacrosanct and inviolate, but they aren't. I mean, they were created through a political arena of human beings. And if they were created, they can easily be uncreated. We've seen some evidence of that already in the last administration. If we're going to protect the parks, the only way we're going to protect them is if people care about them. And the only way that people are going to care about them is through, sometimes they come to the parks with that understanding, and they really didn't need us park educators, interpreters, and that's fine. But for some people, we were kind of like taking the paintings in an art museum that were turned to the wall, and our job was to turn them so everybody could appreciate them. That was the job of a park interpreter, to help people care about the places more than they might have on their own. So through understanding, appreciation, long-term protection. That's what we were all about. But a few other things came to mind to me when I worked for the National Park Service, and these are sort of just a few kind of random thoughts. I don't even know how well they connect. And the first one I don't want to talk about a lot because it could be a whole subject matter of its own. But what I loved about the national park ideal, and recognize that the ideal isn't always the reality, but the ideal is that the parks were here for everybody. And I love that idea. The democracy of the parks, the idea that anybody could come and anybody could visit, and they didn't have to have a lot of money. They just had to have the interest to come. Now, I can speak with forked tongue on that because there's lots of challenges to how the national parks operate and who really does come. How many people of less privilege actually show up in the parks? It's one of the reasons the National Park Service started its urban initiatives. And we call that back in the day, the parks are for the people, when places like Fire Island in New York became a national park and more urban areas became part of the National Park Service. The idea was trying to make them a more welcoming entity for people outside the traditional white, wealthier audience that came to the parks. Nevertheless, I love the ideal and I love the struggle towards making the parks available and welcoming to everybody. Another thing that I thought a lot about as I got involved in the philosophy of national park management is, what are the national parks for? And just as importantly, what are they not for? How do we make the decisions of what things to allow? I used to say in seasonal training to folks that the national parks are better than having a big giant fence around them and saying, if you got the toughness and the grit and the experience to jump in and you know, experience this wilderness area, we're all in for you. But if you can't get over that fence, tough luck. That's not what the national parks said. The national parks were trying to welcome a large audience of people from that world of neon and concrete and steel and remind them that there's a world of beauty in the natural world, and that beauty in the natural world is really the real world. That's the inherent world that protects us all. And we all have the right to be welcomed into these places because that's what makes these parks protected for the long run. And theoretically, that's what allows these places to become, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, islands of hope where nature can run its due course. So when you get down to the brass tacks reality of it, what do you allow in a national park and what don't you allow? And what's your philosophical basis for making those decisions? What if you go into the park superintendent's office with your hang glider and you say, I want to hang glide off of Half Dome down into the valley? You allow it? What if you run a concession operation in the park with a hotel at the bottom of, in Zion Canyon? And the concession operator says, I want to build a tennis court so that people can play tennis in the national park. Or what if you're in Acadia National Park and every night in the summer there's a campground talk done by one of the rangers on the glories of Acadia. And somebody comes to the park superintendent and says, I've got a great idea. How about if we have a classical music concert some night that bumps out, instead of having your ranger talk, you have those all the time. Why don't we just have a classical music concert that night so people can be in that lovely campground amphitheater and listen to classical music? How do you make the decisions about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate? And I wish we had time for a long conversation about that right now, but I'm afraid we probably don't. So I'm going to go to my punchline. Yeah. Yeah, the Morgan Arboretum has, and you have to decide what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and why. So if I jump to the punchline for that, my thoughts go back to the history of one of the park's best philosophers, Frederick Law Olmsted. You may all be familiar with Frederick Law Olmsted because he was the brainstorm behind creating the original necklace of forest preserves around Chicago that I enjoyed when I was a kid. He was the guy who lost the battle at Niagara Falls about how to best protect the falls for people's enjoyment. And he was on the losing side of the argument when he thought that people in horse and buggy shouldn't be able to ride their horse and buggy right up to the edge of the falls because that was an urban intrusion on this beautiful sacrosanct natural area. He's the one who was the guiding light behind creating Central Park in New York City. When people poo-pooed the idea because Central Park was so far out in the boonies that only rich people could get there. So he was an incredibly forward-thinking guy, a landscape architect, but also a philosopher of natural area protection and how do we do it. And the line that I always think of when I think of the idea that I think of when I think of Frederick Olmsted in terms of what national parks are for and not for, is he said, you need to go back to the enabling legislation of the area. What was this place protected for in the first place? And if the uses that you are suggesting or advocating for support the purposes for which that park was initially preserved, then it's probably okay. But if it's a purpose that creates a barrier between you and the resources for which the park was preserved, it's probably suspect. And so I wish every national park superintendent would have that little clicker going in their head. And there are politics and there are other things, but at least if you could stay on course, you would know why you were staying on course or why you had to go off course. So if we go back to my 3 examples, what were they? Which ones did I say? Hang gliding. Yeah, so let's start with hang gliding. I would suggest, and I'm sorry to kind of leap through with missing more discussion here, but hang gliding celebrates itself. So if you're at the bottom of Yosemite Canyon there to enjoy Yosemite Valley and you're there to enjoy the glories of Yosemite Valley, and you see somebody hang gliding, what are you thinking about? You're thinking about the spectacle of hang gliding. You're not thinking about the pristine beauties of Yosemite Valley. So I, in my purity as a park superintendent, would say, nope, no hang gliding. See if you can get away with it. That's the next question. What was my next example?
Tennis court.
I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, tennis court. But you're listening to yourself, to me better than I am. So tennis, it's a fine game. Do you want to allow a tennis court? Yeah, you see where we're going with this. And then the same thing with a classical music concert that bumps out the park rangers talk about Acadia National Park. Doesn't matter if you love classical music or not. I mean, I remember I lost that one at Acadia. It had been long entrenched by the time I came along, and the park superintendent wasn't about to stop it. It was very popular. All kinds of people from town piled in to see this concert. So it continued. But it wasn't in keeping with our purpose. Why was the National Park Service giving up its opportunity to get people excited about the national park and instead allowing somebody to have a classical music concert that celebrated classical music? It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with classical music, but I remember saying to the park superintendent at the time, what if it was a rock concert? Would you allow that? You know, what's your philosophical basis for why you're making these decisions? So anyways, those things were really interesting to me. On to the next topic, carrying capacity concepts. How do you make our parks, you know, they can get loved to death, right, with too much use, and that's a challenge. It's also an opportunity. I would hate thinking that nobody wanted to visit the national parks and they were dying due to lack of popularity. At least people love to visit them. That's hope. But how do we manage that use? And there was a guy many years ago named Joseph Sachs who wrote a book called Mountains Without Handrails. And he said something that always struck with me. The kinds of uses we allow in our natural areas, whether it's a national park or anything else, have a great deal to do with the capacity of that place to hold people. You know, for example, cars reduce dramatically the carrying capacity of a national park, right? One park superintendent I worked with used to say, it's not the number of people that are visiting it's the problem as much as it is the number of cars that are visiting that's the problem. If you have, let's say, but one of the ideas that Joseph Sachs used as an example is if you have let's say you've got a lake that's 4 miles long, half a mile wide, and you allow motorboats on that lake. Somebody takes their motorboat and they spin around, and in a half an hour they're done. And meanwhile, they've interfered with the experience of somebody maybe walking around that lake, or somebody canoeing on that lake, or fishing on that lake, or doing anything else on that lake, because the noise of that motorboat has impacted everybody else's opportunity to enjoy what's supposed to be the serenity of the park. And that motorboat person is done in a half an hour, and they're ready to find the next lake, and the next lake, and the next lake. So thinking about what uses you allow has a lot to do with how many people a place can absorb. And I always thought that was a really important thing for park managers to think about when they were approving or not approving various facilities. And then there's the whole, going on to the next topic of partnerships and local engagement and volunteers. One of the things I learned the longer I worked in the national parks is how much we needed friends. But we needed more than the friends that were our traditional friends. When I started working in park interpretation, and interpretation is a funny word. That's the word we use for education. It's an odd with summer people. That was the classic traditional audience. But the longer I worked there, the more I realized that when issues came up that needed advocacy and support, you know, those people that came to visit us from Wheaton, Illinois, from New York City, anywhere, they weren't there to help us anymore. They had a great summer vacation, but they were gone. And if we had the economic interests of the little town nearby that pretty much ran the city council, pushing against the positive ideas of the National Park Mission, we were going to be in trouble. Because those powerful guys on the city council, they could talk to the congressmen and the senators and get their way. So it became more and more apparent, partly for our own advocacy and protection, that we needed local friends. And also because the Park Service was, at least in Acadia in my day, wasn't getting anywhere near the resources we needed to operate. We hired work-study students from schools. We depended more than we should have on volunteers. We didn't have anywhere near enough. The visitor center wasn't even run by Park Service people. We had work-study students from colleges that we had to kind of train to be park rangers in a week or two. We realized we didn't have enough money to run the park effectively. And so actually I got pretty involved in starting Friends of Acadia, which is another long story unto itself, but Friends of Acadia, it's probably the proudest part of my personal legacy, is an organization that grew from a few of us thinking, you know, the park is struggling for money, and we got all these rich people living in, you know, if you know anything of the history of Acadia National Park, it was a place where all kinds of wealthy people from, it was called Pennsylvania on the Rocks, actually. Wealthy people from New England, Pennsylvania, New York would come to the shorelines of Mount Desert Island, which is the island that most of Acadia is on, and they built their summer cottages, which were, you know, like 50-room mansions. They were only cottages because they weren't available for wintertime use.
Before the days of air conditioning.
Before the days of air conditioning, this was a respite. And as these cities were becoming more and more industrialized and less pleasant with all this crud that got spewed into the air, Mount Desert Island became one of the refuges for the wealthy who could afford their cottages. And that tradition continues to this day. And in the 1980s, we were sitting there in the park strangling, thinking, we don't have any money to operate. Nobody's paying any attention to us from the federal government, at least not nearly enough attention. And then we thought, why can't we get these, the National Park in Acadia grew out of the philanthropy of those wealthy summer people who donated most of the land to create the first national park east of the Mississippi. Why don't we ask their kids and their kids' kids if they can donate some of their money to help support this park? And the idea took off, and today Friends of Acadia has about 25 permanent staff members and has raised millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to renovate the carriage roads, to renovate the trail system, to now building summer housing, because there's no summer housing available that people can afford. So rangers, last summer at Acadia, for example, they didn't hire 30% of the staff they wanted to hire because nobody could afford to live there. So the Friends of Acadia is working in cooperation with the park to build affordable housing for summer employees. So they've done a lot of really great things that the Park Service could never do on their own. And another thing about that is that the Park Service, because it's part of the federal government and part of the executive branch, we can't lobby ourselves. We can't go to our senators and congressmen and say, this is what we need, because you can't lobby yourself. But a Friends organization can lobby on your behalf. So the Friends organizations were important for that. And there are Friends organizations in many national parks around the country today. And they're vitally important for the management and support, both from a political advocacy perspective as well as a plain old fundraising capacity. That's another topic we could talk about forever. When is the federal government supposed to support these parks? When is private philanthropy supposed to support the parks? And that's a whole other conversation. But in terms of building support for the national parks, I realized that the education and interpretive side of things had to grow beyond, and it's still very important to talk to visitors who come from away. When I worked in interpretation in the national parks, I oftentimes thought as my mom, as my audience, because you could get self-doubting. You'd say, why are we talking to all these people who voluntarily come to us? These are the people that are already on my side, right? What good am I doing? Am I just an entertainment crew? And I realized, no, I'm way more than an entertainment crew. And I personally use my own mom as my audience. Partly it inspired me to take the time and effort to do good programs. Partly it was because I knew my mom, who was already on our side, still needed, she lived in Skokie, Illinois. She still needed that inspiration, that kick in that kick in the pants to say, yes, this is important. And yes, I might just go home and I might give a little bit more money to the Sierra Club or the Friends of Acadia, or I'm going to make sure I vote the right way. And all of those things. And she needed that. And she just personally, she needed that love and that inspiration that comes from visiting a park, and she deserved that. So all of those things were part of my role in thinking that park interpretation was really important, because I was talking to people who were willing to go with me. I had an audience that was ready to say, through understanding appreciation, long-term protection. So if you can't tell by now, the National Park Service was about the favorite part of my career. But for a variety of reasons, I left the National Park Service and I worked for another agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for another 13 years. And I did that to go back to Maine, and I worked in an organization called the Gulf of Maine Coastal Program. There are 3 branches of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of you are probably familiar with the National Wildlife Refuges. That's a part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. People are more part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that more people are familiar with, because it's land-based and you can visit and see amazing concentrations of wildlife at the right times of year. There's a law enforcement division that's smaller, that focuses on interstate travel. You know, like Maine had one law enforcement person, but his job was to think about illegal interstate transport of wildlife. And then the Ecological Services branch is quite large. Most of the Ecological Services branch, but they work behind the scenes, and I wouldn't be surprised if none of you have heard of that. But they do a lot of work behind the scenes to approve or disapprove developments that have to do with federal laws and things like that. I worked in the part of the Ecological Services branch that was non-regulatory. We tried to find a different path. We grew out of the more regulatory traditional Ecological Services branch, where some guys in the Chesapeake Bay who were the field leaders for that Ecological Services office realized that, you know, we're winning a couple battles in this regulatory world, but we're losing the war. Chesapeake Bay isn't getting better, and we've been working hard our whole career. What else can we do? And these 2 guys invented the idea of the coastal program, which was to focus resources in coastal areas and do them in a non-regulatory way. The reasons for that is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, first of all, there's two aspects of that. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has 3 kind of umbrellas of what we call our trust resources. Endangered species, Canada lynx, sea-run fish, like alewives, which are good on the eastern seaboard. They're not like the invasive ones that come into the Great Lakes. They're tremendous. And migratory birds. So migratory birds, sea-run fish, endangered species are what we call our trust resources. Where are they concentrated? In the United States? Near the coasts, including the Great Lakes. So there's a coastal program around the Great Lakes too. But all of those trust resources of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are concentrated in coastal areas. And where are most of the people? On the coast. So where are most of our trust resources? Where are most of the threats? That's why they decided to call it the coastal program. And they decided to make it a non-regulatory program so that we could work with people who wanted to work with us. We weren't trying to work with the people that were fighting against us all the time, and we were losing too many of the times. We wanted to say, those guys knew that there were lots of people who were rooting for us, but they needed some kind of envelope to bring us together, to organize us so that we could have a partnership to work with the people who wanted to work with us and make progress where everybody wanted to. So that was what the coastal program was about. And those numbers down here are just, well, in the 13 years I worked for our Gulf of Maine coastal program, those are some of the, the metrics that I was involved in. I wrote a zillion grants, about $15 million worth of federal grants that led to the permanent protection of 40,000 acres. We did 68 land protection projects, 30 habitat restoration projects, most of in coastal Maine. And then I left the Fish and Wildlife Service and I worked for the Swan Song. I used to say I had, in the first half of my career was the National Park Service, the second half was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the third half was a land trust. And I worked for a small Down East land trust for the 5 years on a part-time basis. But I wanted to mention something about land trusts. I don't think they're nearly as common in Illinois as they are in Maine and other parts of the country. But I did discover with a little Google search that there are some land trusts in Illinois. But land trusts normally work, and they're private organizations that work to protect lands through fee and easement acquisition. Fee acquisition is when you actually own it outright. An easement is when a private person continues to own it, but they've put deed restrictions on their land that protect the natural resource values or whatever values that two entities decide they want to protect on the property. So nationwide, there are about 1,300 land trusts. 61 million acres have been protected by the land trusts. 70% of the growth in protected lands since 2015 in our country has happened through the land trusts. So it's a big deal. In Maine, we have a lot of land trusts, over 80 of them. I worked for the Pleasant River Wildlife Foundation. In Illinois, less land trusts, but some significant protection. And I discovered, I don't know anything about it, I just saw it on Google, so believe it if it's true. There's a land trust called the Conservation Foundation in Naperville that's protected 38,000 acres. But a couple last philosophical things I wanted to mention are that, you know, in the government, we were always told, you know, we had to justify what we were doing, right? Al Gore even popularized that. We had to come up with metrics to justify what we did. And oh my goodness, that took a tremendous amount of time. And some of it was really silly. I understand the importance of doing, you know, being accountable. But the trick is, how do you account for it? And computers know how to account with numbers. But it isn't necessarily very sensible. A couple quick examples. On the coast of Maine, I might have worked diligently for 5 years to protect a beautiful seabird island. Really important. Not nearly enough islands protecting seabirds. The seabird population is declining. Some of these special islands deserve protection instead of somebody's summer house on it that would make it impossible for those seabirds to survive. I might work 5 years to protect that island. In the end, I could write on my little chart, we protected 3 acres. Alternatively, and I might have been the leader of this charge to make that happen. Alternatively, somebody in my office, could have been me, it could have been anybody, shows up at some big meeting where they want to do a big easement on 1 million acres of land in the northern forest. And you might be one of 30 people in the audience and you say something wise for a moment. And so you say, you think you said enough to make a difference on this project? You know, we didn't try to lie on this stuff, but you know, your presence was helpful. And so you write on your chart at the end of the year, we protected 1 million acres. So what is that? If you're not being sensible to your conservation biology mission, you ignore the seabird island, right? And you protect 1 million acres with an easement. But the next, so that's the quantity question, but there's also the quality question. What are you protecting that 1 million acres for? Depends how the easement is written. And if the easement says that commercial logging is allowed, and in fact, that easement is allowing things to stay just as they've been for the last 45, 50 years, you're not really changing anything. It doesn't mean that the easement isn't important, because at least in the long run, maybe you've prevented it from turning into Disney World. But it's this. It's not this. It doesn't mean one is important and one is unimportant, but how do you quantify that stuff? The same thing in the restoration arena. How many river miles are you protecting when you take a dam? How many river miles are you protecting? Because those are the questions we get asked when you take a dam out at the beginning of this watershed. Well, protecting for what? Because different fish, for example, different sea-run fish go to different places. Some spawn in lakes, some spawn in the main stem, some spawn in tributaries. So did you take that dam out for the salmon that might run upstream? Or the alewives that are going up to some headwater pond? And how do you even count tributaries? Count just.
Got to stay by the mic. You need to stay by the microphone and use the pointer.
You count, how do you count the tributaries? Do you count the main stem? Do you count just the main part of the tributary? Do you count the little streams off of them? So with an honest perspective, you could say when you took that dam out, you protected 10 river miles. Or you could probably say you protected 1,243 river miles. And both answers are equally correct. So the silliness in this is, somewhere I wrote down this great quote, of course, from Mark Twain. Most people use statistics the way a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than enlightenment. So, and of course, all the things that are most important in the world really can't be measured. The act of measuring, in fact, can sometimes only trivialize the things that are intangible and complex and really deserve our attention. Finally, one last thing, and I know I'm running over a couple of minutes, but the one thing I've learned in my career, you know that the National Park Service was my favorite part of my career. I enjoyed all of my career for different reasons, but I realized that what I said when I first started working in the national parks, that they were islands of hope, is sadly not true for some of the reasons that I've got listed there. I mean, those statistics are so, I heard that second one, the 70% of the Earth's vertebrates have died out in the last 50 years. I'm not even sure that's true. So I shouldn't have written it. I heard it on a New York Times report recently, and it was so distressing. I couldn't even stay with it, but I'm pretty sure that's what they said. 70% of the Earth's vertebrates have died in the last 50 years. 3 wolf packs in Yellowstone were destroyed last winter by having the audacity of putting a step off the park boundary into some rancher's land. One of my favorite national parks that I worked in always was Zion. I didn't even realize that until I read this recently, black bears and badgers blinked out at Zion. It's not big enough. Populations, the areas are too small. Populations of the animals are small. There's inbreeding depression due to habitat fragmentation, inadequate or no corridors to allow animals to move from place to place. And then the fancy conservation biology word stochastic events basically means random things happen. There's a fire, there's a small population, and then a fire comes. Or there's a virus that comes in, or whatever. And the populations just blink out. But we're not ending on that. National parks were oftentimes described as America's best idea. If you visited the national parks, you've probably heard that said. Well, I think there's another next great idea that moves us beyond, dare I say, just national parks. It's the idea of building biotic conveyor belts that allow species the freedom of movement essential for their long-term survival. Conservation biologists started understanding that in the late 1970s, but it didn't really hit, when I was in college, it didn't hit the textbooks. And a lot of people that were running the national parks had been educated a long time before that. So it took a long time for this word to really get out, but now it was important before climate change added urgency, and it's even more urgent today. So for example, there's a huge initiative out west called The Spine of the Continent. There's a great book written called The Spine of the Continent, if you're interested. And it talks about the dream of creating a protected corridor that's sizable enough for grizzly bears to use. Because if it works for grizzlies, it's probably going to work for everybody else. That runs from the northern part of Canada down the spine of the Rockies all the way to Mexico. And there's real work on that regard. And it's not all going to be a national park. It's going to be a mosaic of land trust properties, national wildlife refuges, federal lands of all sorts, private lands, ranchers' lands that can all create a corridor that makes life viable. Because even the largest national parks aren't big enough to protect life in the United States. And to make this happen, I guess it requires that we connect our hearts and our minds to honor and protect our one and only Earth, where millions of years of evolution have created an oasis of interconnected living beings in this crazy place we call home. There you have it.
Thanks so much. Speaking as a person who almost died in two different national parks, Crater Lake and Isle Royale, thank you for supporting our national parks. We have time for some questions. I know we're running long on time, but if you have to leave, that's fine. But any thoughts or questions or input, we'd love to harvest from people. You two have spent a lot of time. Are you still doing volunteers in the park, Jane and Jim? No. Aged out of the program. Wow, they stopped you, huh?
We did experience Acadia National Park, and we've incorporated the word viewscaping into our vocabulary as far as modifying the environment to improve the visibility to natural events and structures.
Unless you're going to use this one.
Yeah.
Why don't you stay at the microphone and then? Okay.
I'm sorry. Could you say?
Viewscaping, he was talking.
Yeah, the concept of viewscaping is present at Acadia National Park, and it's the tendency to improve the visibility to the natural environment by shepherding the natural environment, trimming the bushes along the roadside, so on and so forth. And we did run into, while we were volunteers, to try to get into another setting, we ran into a fellow, we were at Acadia, we had a volunteer give us the walk over Cadillac Mountain, and that 45-minute or hour walk. And we interacted with him, and then fast forward a couple of years, and we were at Big Bend in Texas, and lo and behold, here's the same individual living the other 6 months of the year at Big Bend. And we spoke with him about the experience that he was 6 months at Acadia and 6 months at Big Bend, and he just took his RV from one place to the other, and that was his life.
Right,
And
that's a lot of us did that. I did that early. Could everybody hear what he was saying?
Yeah.
I did that early in my career. When I was, that's part of how I gathered up so many parks, all 10 parks in my, retinue, is by having a summer seasonal job in one park, a winter seasonal job in another park, summer seasonal job in another park. We all of those of us who did that would kind of talk to each other about it. It was a great time. I loved that time in my life. It was, you're basically being a gypsy, moving around every 6 months from one great place to another great place, meeting wonderful people in each park. So that was like being a year-round seasonal employee, is what we called it. And we used to talk about that, saying a lot of people would think this is really weird that we do this, but we did, and it was fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I worked for the concessions in Crater Lake National Park for a summer, and that's a whole other way to get involved with the national parks too, but they're kind of in the money-making aspect of it.
Several years ago, Phyllis and I were at Grand Canyon.
I'm sorry.
several years ago, Phyllis and I were at the Grand Canyon. And of course, you walk up there and there's this hole. And you look at it, and the very first thought is, eh. Young couple came up behind us, walked up to the edge, looked, went, eh, walked away. And we stood there and looked and looked and looked, as there was movement. There was movement down there about a third of the way down, and it was a person on a mule. And there were 20 of them, and they were that big. And all of a sudden it came into perspective, oh my goodness, what am I looking at? And for the next hour you just sit there and go, wow.
Yeah, I can admit that the first time I saw the Grand Canyon, I was, like someone else said, I was a little underwhelmed, mostly because you see so many beautiful photographs of the Grand Canyon that when you actually walk up to the rim, it might not be quite as astounding as that photoshopped photograph that you saw in the calendar image. And I mean, it looks like what you expect it to look like, and you don't really have a conception of the scale, as you're saying. That's why, for me, I mean, your hint was seeing the people on the mules, or the burros, I guess. And my way to get beyond that initial vastness was to hike in.
I was going to say that I spent time at some of those fantastic places, and hiking into the base of the Grand Canyon is something, but also at Crater Lake. When I worked there, we saw people drive up, and you'd have to drive from a tiny little town in Oregon 70 miles to get to this place. And they'd get up there and they'd look, and they didn't know what else to do next. And that's part of the job of an interpreter, is to open up the park to people, because you saw so many people that got up there, looked over the side, saw this big blue lake, and saw the island in the middle, and saw what they were going to see. That kind of confirmed that, yes, the calendar pictures are correct, you know. And then and then they'd walk away. They'd go to the store, right? And they'd get a lunch, and they'd buy a little trinket, and then they'd leave. You know, and that's a shame that the national parks, you know, maybe are caught
Well,
that way.
one of the things I would say to that is that part of the beauty of the national parks is they allow people to come at whatever level they're ready to come. And it's not my job to judge how they're enjoying their visit to the park. They, they, when we were kids, when we would go to the national parks, my mom didn't want to camp because this was her vacation too, she would say. And it's harder to make breakfast in a campsite than it is at home. If that's my job, I'm going to stay home. So we would go to the lodges and in the parks, and it really helped me understand over time that there are different ways to enter these places and become fans of these places. And the first time somebody comes, and if what they do is they go to the rim of Crater Lake and they look in and then they leave, if that was enough to inspire them, that's fine. I